I should have stayed quiet, but the moment I saw the reflection of a gun barrel in the polished marble floor, I realized silence would get someone killed. My name is Emily Carter, 24 years old, waitress at a small Italian restaurant on the north side of Chicago. The kind of place where the espresso machine screams louder than the customers and the tips barely cover rent. That night I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a mansion worth more than every apartment I'd ever lived in combined, but my manager had called 2 hours before my shift ended and said a private party needed extra staff. Good pay, cash, just carry trays and keep your head down. Sounded simple. By the time the rideshare dropped me off outside the Russo estate, the sun had already disappeared behind the lake, and the long driveway lights glowed like a runway guiding expensive cars toward the house. The mansion itself looked unreal, 3 stories of stone and glass stretching across the hill like something from a movie. I remember thinking one thing very clearly as I walked through the front gate with my borrowed uniform and cheap black flats. People who live in houses like this don't worry about rent. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne. A house manager handed me a silver tray and pointed me toward the kitchen where 2 other servers were already arranging glasses. No one explained whose house it was, but everyone spoke in quiet voices, like the walls might be listening. I spent the next hour moving between the dining room and the patio, refilling drinks and pretending not to notice the men in tailored suits speaking in low tones. They weren't loud, but something about the way they watched the doors made my stomach tighten. Around 10:30 the party started thinning out. Most of the guests moved toward the terrace, leaving the back hallway strangely quiet. I was returning empty glasses to the kitchen when I heard 2 voices coming from the study just off the hall. The door was slightly open. I didn't mean to listen. I really didn't. But then I heard a name that made the air in my lungs freeze. Husu. One of the men laughed softly and said he wasn't supposed to be home tonight. The other replied that the plan would only take a minute once he walked through the door. I stood there holding a tray that suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. I didn't know who Russo was yet, but I knew exactly what they meant. My heart started pounding so hard I thought they might hear it through the wall. I should have walked away. I should have minded my own business like every survival instinct told me to. But before I could move, the front door opened somewhere down the hall. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Slow. Confident. The kind of footsteps that made the entire house feel like it belonged to whoever was walking. A tall man turned the corner at the end of the hallway, dark suit, calm expression. The kind of presence that made the air feel heavier the moment he entered a room. Dominic Russo had come home early. And in less than 30 seconds he was about to walk straight into a trap he didn't know existed. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I stepped forward, grabbed his sleeve lightly, and whispered the only words that came to mind. Stay quiet. Dominic Russo kept looking at me as if the answer mattered more than the interruption that had just unfolded in his own hallway. For a man whose house was large enough to echo with footsteps and quiet conversations, the silence between us suddenly felt very small. I realized my hands were still gripping the edge of the silver tray so tightly that my fingers had turned pale. Somewhere down the hall the front door opened and closed again, followed by the distant sound of a car engine starting outside. The 2 men from the study were leaving. Dominic did not watch them go. His attention stayed on me. I swallowed and shifted my weight slightly in my cheap black flats, suddenly very aware that my entire life looked nothing like the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers surrounding us. I work at Romano's Trattoria on Clark Street, I said quietly. They needed extra servers tonight. I was just supposed to carry drinks and stay out of the way. Dominic's expression did not change, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes now, like he was placing pieces of information into the correct order. You listen instead, he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement. I shook my head quickly. I was walking past the study when I heard them say your name. Anyone would have stopped. That was only partly true. Most people probably would have walked away and pretended they never heard anything. Dominic seemed to understand that too. He studied my face for another long second before glancing toward the staircase where the 2 security men still stood quietly. His voice lowered slightly. Did anyone else hear them?
No, iyan suarat.
I do not think so. The kitchen is on the other side of the house. Dominic nodded once. The calm confidence in his posture returned fully, like the situation had already been placed neatly back into his control. He stepped a little closer, not threatening, but close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the hallway lights in his eyes. You should go back to the kitchen, Emily, he said. Your manager will be looking for you. The way he said my name still unsettled me. I had not told him who I was, yet he spoke it as if he had known it all evening. I opened my mouth, hesitating. Are you going to be all right? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Dominic looked slightly surprised for the first time since I met him. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the kind that appears when someone hears something unexpected, but not unpleasant. I have dealt with more complicated evenings than this one, he said calmly. I believed him. Everything about Dominic Russo suggested a man who was used to complicated situations. Still, my feet did not move right away. Maybe because a strange feeling had settled in my chest, something between relief and worry. Dominic noticed the hesitation and tilted his head slightly. There is something else you want to ask. I hesitated another second before speaking. How did you know my name? The question hung between us like the quiet after a bell stops ringing. Dominic did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim black phone. He tapped the screen once, then turned it toward me. On the display was a security camera image from earlier that evening. The front gate of the mansion, a rideshare car pulling away, and me stepping through the gate holding my borrowed server apron. Dominic slipped the phone back into his pocket. In my house, he said calmly, I try to know who walks through the door. The realization made my stomach flutter again. I had spent the entire evening believing I was invisible, just another waitress carrying glasses through a rich man's party. But Dominic Russo had been aware of me from the moment I arrived. He looked at me for one more quiet second before speaking again. And now I know something else about you. I frowned slightly. What is that? Dominic's voice stayed calm, but there was a new weight behind his words. You are the kind of person who risks her own safety to warn a stranger. He paused briefly. That is not a common quality in this city. Dominic Russo's words lingered in the hallway long after he finished speaking, and for a moment I did not know how to respond. The mansion suddenly felt quieter than before, the distant sounds of the party fading behind thick walls and polished doors. I shifted the tray in my hands again, realizing I had been standing there far longer than a waitress normally should in someone else's house. I was supposed to be invisible tonight. Just another uniform moving between tables. Instead, I had somehow ended up in a private hallway having a conversation with the man who owned the entire estate. I finally let out a small breath. Maybe that quality is just called common sense where I come from, I said softly. If someone is about to walk into trouble, you warn them. Dominic watched me carefully, the faint smile from earlier still resting at the corner of his mouth. Chicago does not reward that kind of instinct very often, he replied. His tone was calm, not cynical, just honest. I had lived in this city long enough to know he was not wrong. Still, something about the way he said it made me feel like he was studying more than just my answer. He was measuring something about me that I did not fully understand. The two security men near the staircase shifted slightly but remained silent, their attention focused on the hallway without interrupting the conversation. Dominic glanced toward them briefly, then back to me. The rest of the staff is in the kitchen, correct? He asked. I nodded. Yes. There are 3 other servers and the house manager. Dominic considered that for a moment before speaking again. Good. The rest of the evening will continue as planned. No one needs to know there was a misunderstanding in the hallway. The word misunderstanding sounded deliberate, like he was choosing it carefully. I nodded again, though I was not entirely sure what had just been misunderstood. Dominic stepped slightly to the side, giving me space to pass toward the kitchen. For a second I thought the conversation was finished. I started to walk past him, the soft tap of my shoes echoing against the marble floor. Then his voice stopped me again. Emily. I turned back. Dominic was watching me with that same thoughtful expression. Earlier tonight, when you heard those men speaking, you could have walked away and finished your shift. No one would have blamed you. I shrugged lightly. Maybe. But then I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what happened after you walked through that door. Dominic nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. That kind of curiosity can be dangerous in the wrong environment, he said. The way he spoke made it sound less like a warning and more like an observation. I offered a small smile. Being curious is how people learn things. Dominic's expression softened slightly, almost amused. You are not wrong. The quiet stretched again for a moment before he continued. When your shift ends tonight, a car will take you home. The statement caught me off guard. That is not necessary, I said quickly. My rideshare account still works. Dominic shook his head once. It is not about transportation. It is about making sure the person who helped me tonight gets home safely. The words were simple, but the weight behind them made my chest tighten a little. I had come here expecting nothing more than a few extra dollars and maybe sore feet from standing too long. Instead, the night had turned into something far stranger. I hesitated before answering. Thank you, I said quietly. Dominic inclined his head slightly, like the matter was already settled. Now go back to the kitchen before your manager starts asking questions. I nodded and finally continued down the hallway. The tray balanced in my hands as I moved toward the warm lights of the kitchen door. But as I reached the corner and glanced back once more, Dominic Russo was still standing in the hallway watching me leave, and something about that look told me the night had changed more than either of us expected. I pushed open the kitchen door and stepped back into the warm noise of clattering plates and running water. The sudden shift from the quiet marble hallway to the busy kitchen made it feel like I had walked between two completely different worlds. Maria, one of the other servers, looked up from the counter where she was polishing wine glasses. There you are, she said quickly. I thought you disappeared. The manager has been asking where the extra tray went. I lifted the tray in my hands slightly and forced a small smile. Just returning dishes from the hallway, I said. She shrugged and went back to her glasses, clearly more interested in finishing her shift than questioning anything else. The kitchen smelled like roasted garlic and fresh bread, and for a moment the normalcy of it helped slow my heartbeat. I set the tray down beside the sink and reached for a towel to dry my hands. But my mind was still replaying everything that had happened upstairs. The quiet study door. The two men stepping into the hallway. The calm way Dominic Russo had handled it without raising his voice even once. I had grown up in Chicago long enough to hear his name before tonight. People spoke about him in low tones, usually in stories that involved business deals, expensive restaurants, or neighborhoods that suddenly improved after his companies bought half the buildings. But hearing stories about someone and standing 10 feet away from them were two very different things. Maria nudged my elbow lightly. Earth to Emily. You look like you just saw a ghost. I shook my head quickly. Just tired, I said. Long shift. She laughed quietly. Welcome to the restaurant business. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of trays and polite smiles. Guests finished their drinks on the terrace, and the house manager directed us through the final rounds of clearing glasses and collecting plates. Every once in a while I caught myself glancing toward the hallway door, half expecting Dominic to appear again. He did not. It was almost midnight when the last of the guests left the mansion. The staff gathered near the back entrance to collect our pay envelopes, each of us counting the cash quickly before slipping it into our pockets. The house manager thanked us politely and told everyone the driver would take the servers back toward downtown. I hesitated when I heard that. Dominic had mentioned a car for me earlier, but I assumed it was just a polite gesture that would disappear once the night ended. Maria pulled on her jacket and nodded toward the driveway outside. Looks like the ride is waiting already, she said. I stepped outside with the others and immediately noticed the difference. Two black sedans were parked near the gate, one for the catering staff and one sitting a little farther up the driveway by itself. A tall driver in a dark coat stood beside the second car, holding the rear door open as if he had been expecting someone. When he saw me step out of the house, he gave a small respectful nod. Miss Carter, he said calmly. Mr. Russo asked that I take you home. Maria looked at me with raised eyebrows. Well, that is a first, she whispered. I felt my face warm slightly as I stepped toward the car. Thank you, I said quietly. The driver closed the door behind me once I was seated and moved around to the front. As the car rolled down the long driveway, I glanced back at the mansion through the rear window. Most of the lights were already off, leaving only a few glowing softly against the stone walls. The house looked peaceful again, like nothing unusual had happened there at all. But I knew better now. And as the city lights of Chicago slowly grew brighter in the distance, one thought kept circling in my mind. Dominic Russo had said the night was under control, but somehow I had the feeling our story had only just begun. I watched the city lights glide past the car window as the driver guided the sedan onto Lakeshore Drive. Chicago at night had a strange beauty to it, the skyline glowing against the dark water like a painting made of glass and electricity. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. The driver kept his attention on the road while the quiet hum of the engine filled the space between us. I leaned back against the leather seat, still trying to process how a simple extra shift had turned into one of the strangest nights of my life. I finally glanced toward the driver. "You do not have to drive all the way downtown if it is out of the way," I said politely. "I live in a small apartment near Wrigleyville." The driver nodded once without taking his eyes off the road. "Mr. Russo provided the address already, Miss Carter." The words made me pause. I had not told Dominic where I lived. A small shiver ran down my spine, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that Dominic Russo was the kind of man who rarely left details to chance. The car continued through the quiet streets for another 10 minutes before slowing near my block. My apartment building looked exactly the same as it always did. An old brick structure with a flickering hallway light, and a small convenience store on the corner that stayed open until 2 in the morning. The sedan stopped smoothly by the curb. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door for me. "Thank you for the ride," I said as I climbed out onto the sidewalk. He gave a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Carter." The car pulled away moments later, its taillights disappearing at the end of the street. I stood there for a second looking up at the familiar windows of my building, trying to convince myself the evening had ended. But the night still felt unfinished somehow, like a book with the last chapter missing. I climbed the narrow stairs to my second-floor apartment and unlocked the door. The small space greeted me with the quiet hum of my refrigerator, and the faint ticking of the wall clock above the kitchen sink. Everything looked ordinary. My worn couch, my stack of nursing textbooks on the coffee table, my shoes kicked off by the door that morning before I rushed to work. I set my bag down and poured a glass of water from the tap, leaning against the counter while the cool silence of the apartment settled around me. For the first time since leaving the mansion, I allowed myself to breathe normally again. Maybe that was the end of it. Maybe tomorrow I would wake up, go to my classes, work another shift at Romano's Trattoria, and tonight would become nothing more than a strange story I could barely believe myself. I had just placed the glass in the sink when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. I unlocked the phone and opened the message. The text was short. "Thank you for speaking up tonight." I stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared again before another message arrived. "You already know." I leaned back against the counter, my heart beating a little faster again. "Dominique Russo." Of course it was him. I typed slowly. I thought the evening was over. The reply came a few seconds later. "Most people would hope that is true." I frowned slightly at the screen. What does that mean? This time the typing dots stayed for several seconds before the final message appeared. It means someone who planned something tonight might still wonder how their plan changed. I felt a chill run through me even though the apartment was warm. I looked toward the locked door, suddenly aware of every quiet sound in the hallway outside. Another message appeared. "Do not worry, Emily. I have already made sure no one followed you home." I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath. My thumbs hovered over the screen before I typed one more question. "Why are you telling me this?" The reply came almost instantly. "Because the moment you warned me tonight, you became part of the story whether you wanted to or not." My eyes stayed on the glowing screen of my phone long after the last message appeared. The apartment around me felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved a few inches closer while I was not paying attention. I read Dominic's words again slowly. "The moment you warned me tonight, you became part of the story whether you wanted to or not." I placed the phone down on the counter and rubbed my temples, trying to think clearly. This was exactly why people avoided getting involved in situations that did not belong to them. One moment you are serving drinks at a private party, and the next moment a man like Dominic Russo is telling you that you are part of something much bigger than you understand. My phone buzzed again before I could finish the thought. Another message appeared. "Do not panic." That line almost made me laugh. It was the kind of thing someone said that guaranteed the opposite reaction. I typed slowly. "I am not panicking." I am just trying to understand why any of this still involves me. The typing dots appeared again. Then his reply arrived. Because the two men tonight did not expect witnesses. The word witnesses made my stomach tighten slightly. I glanced toward the apartment door again even though it was still locked. I typed another message. I did not see anything except them talking in the study. Dominic's response came back quickly. That is exactly what they do not know. I stared at the screen for a moment, realizing what he meant. If those men believed someone had overheard their conversation, they might start asking questions. Questions that could eventually lead back to the waitress walking through the hallway at the wrong time. I sat down on the small couch near the window and looked out at the quiet street below. A taxi passed slowly, headlights washing across the brick buildings before disappearing down the block. The city outside looked peaceful, but my mind kept returning to Dominic's message. Another vibration from my phone pulled my attention back. I have people keeping an eye on the area tonight, Dominic wrote. Nothing unusual so far. The idea that someone might actually be watching the street outside my apartment was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. I typed again. That seems like a lot of trouble for someone you met 10 minutes ago. There was a longer pause this time before his answer arrived. I met someone tonight who made a decision most people would not make. Silence filled the apartment while I considered that. Then another message followed. That kind of decision deserves protection. I leaned back into the couch cushion and exhaled slowly. I had grown up believing the world was divided into simple roles. People like me worked late shifts and worried about rent. People like Dominic Russo owned buildings and made decisions that changed entire neighborhoods. Our lives were not supposed to intersect. Yet somehow tonight they had crossed in the middle of a quiet hallway. I looked down at the phone again and typed one more question before I could stop myself. What happens now? The reply took almost a full minute to appear. When it did, the message was shorter than any of the others. Now we wait. I frowned slightly at the screen. Wait for what? This time the response came with unusual speed. For whoever expected tonight to go differently to decide their next move. The words lingered in the quiet apartment long after the screen dimmed again. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees along the sidewalk, and the city continued its ordinary rhythm. But I had the uneasy feeling that somewhere in Chicago, someone else was already realizing their plan had failed, and they were probably asking the same question I had just asked Dominic. What happens now? I sat on the couch for a long time after Dominic's last message, staring at the dim screen of my phone while the quiet of the apartment wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Outside my window, Chicago continued its usual rhythm. A distant siren passed somewhere along Clark Street. A couple laughed while walking past the convenience store on the corner. Everything sounded normal, but my thoughts kept circling the same realization. Somewhere out there someone had expected Dominic Russo to walk into that hallway tonight without warning. And now that plan had failed. I set my phone on the coffee table and leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me. Maybe Dominic was right. Maybe the smartest thing to do now was exactly what he said. Wait. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Then 1 in the morning. Eventually exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted into a restless sleep on the couch. The next morning sunlight spilled through the window and landed directly across my face. I blinked awake, disoriented for a moment before the memories of the previous night returned all at once. The mansion. The hallway. Dominic's calm voice telling me to stay quiet. I sat up slowly and checked my phone. No new messages. The silence almost made me feel foolish for worrying. Maybe Dominic had been overly cautious. Maybe the situation had already ended the moment those two men left the house. I showered, pulled on my jeans and a gray sweater, and grabbed my nursing textbooks from the kitchen table. By the time I stepped outside, the neighborhood had fully come alive. Delivery trucks rolled past the corner store. Someone was walking a golden retriever down the sidewalk. Everything looked like an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had just started toward the bus stop when a familiar black sedan turned the corner and slowed near the curb beside me. The window lowered smoothly and the same driver from the night before gave a polite nod. Good morning, Miss Carter. I stopped in surprise. Good morning. Is something wrong? The driver shook his head. Mr. Russo asked me to deliver a message in person this morning. My pulse quickened slightly. What message? The driver reached into the front seat and handed me a small white envelope through the window. Dominic believes you deserve to hear this before anyone else, he said calmly. I took the envelope, my fingers brushing the thick paper as curiosity rushed through me again. The driver inclined his head once more before the sedan pulled away down the street. I stood there on the sidewalk holding the envelope while people passed by on their way to work, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. After a moment I opened it. Inside was a single card with Dominic's unmistakably precise handwriting. Emily, it read, you asked what happens next. I folded the card open the rest of the way. The message continued in the same steady script. What happens next is that someone will eventually realize their plan failed, because a waitress refused to stay silent. I felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety while reading the final line. And when that moment comes, I would prefer that you are not standing alone when it does. I lowered the card slowly, the morning sunlight warming the paper in my hands. For a few seconds I simply watched the traffic move along the street, thinking about how different everything had looked just 24 hours ago. Yesterday I had been just another student working late shifts and counting tips to pay rent. Today I was holding a message from one of the most powerful men in Chicago, a man who seemed determined to keep me connected to whatever had started inside that quiet hallway. I slipped the card back into the envelope and looked down the street where the black sedan had disappeared. A part of me still wanted to believe the night was an accident that would fade away. But another part of me understood something important had already changed. Because sometimes a single whisper in the right moment can alter the path of an entire story. And whether I liked it or not, Dominic Russo had made it clear that my whisper had already done exactly that.